think very few people seem to have looked at history in the context of how is the law being adhered to, constitutional law, understanding the events that unfold.
We can look at history and we can talk about morality. Welcome back, Will.
Good to see you. Fantastic. Looking forward to this section.
How's things?
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah, lots of, like you, I think, lots of deep reading and research into the 17th century. So,
this is chapter 2 on Charles I. Should we start with the slides?
Let's go for it. Okay.
This will give the audience a little bit of background. So Charles I, 1625 to 1649. Charles believed his political authority and legitimacy came from God, divine right of kings. He saw Parliament as a diminishment of his own royal authority and very rarely consulted them. He dissolved Parliament for 11 years, which established the era of personal rule. 1629 to 1640. Charles's way of governance was unpopular, as were his policies. The divine right mentality, along with the approach on religious reform and taxation, is what caused the War of the Three Kingdoms, the English Civil Wars.
So what might be interesting to say at this point is that there's quite a delicate balance here and an understanding of how things should be. So clearly the divine right of kings, we're well in that now. We've had well, even back in the Tudors, we've got, Henry and Elizabeth I just beginning to play that game as well. And then James I was probably one of the worst. Charles I, shocking. So what is this? This is where, of course, they believe that they can do what the hell they like. And that is absolutely fundamentally against the principles of the English Constitution. And so the tradition in the authentic Constitution, right back in the day. So when are we talking? We're talking about the tradition that comes from the Anglo-Saxon time. Let's just look at the characterization of the monarch, the head of state, as they would have been originally. Nothing like that at all. Very much that they were respected, a respected elder, you could say. Nothing like this situation. Somebody who was morally a good leader too, and cared about the people. And back in those days, of course, they were really elected as well. So this idea that there was some humility that infused within the position of the monarch. There is absolutely no way that a monarch would be in that position without feeling a sense of humility, a sense of anxiety that, are they doing everything the right way? Is it good? Do they care enough about the people? It was a position of service. So we're talking completely the opposite here. Things have got well out of hand by this point. And the kings were behaving really quite shockingly again. So we'd had it in 1215 with King John for different reasons, absolutely out of control. And then things had massively improved. After that, there was kings were contrite following that episode, much more so at least. In going into the Plantagenets, yes, there were problems as well at various points, but generally speaking, the kings, particularly at the point when they were coming into their reign, were very keen back in those days. So Edward the First being a key one, of course, in 1297, marking down his referencing of the Magna Carta, the original Great Charter of 1215, putting that into his almost like a manifesto, if you like, which was what the statutes were often when they were coming into their reign. This is what I plan to do in my reign, to govern according to legendaire and the law of the land. So that sort of humility, if you like. So here we are with something that is just completely the opposite of that. Sorry, rant over. There you go. Just setting the scene.
So Will, can I ask you a question? So what I was thinking when I was doing this kind of research was I kind of focused on the king's coronation oath.
Yes.
So during this period of time, what would Charles's coronation oath have read?
Okay, okay, so good question, because the coronation oath up until well, certainly around this time still, and it would have been up until a bit later than this, so 1688 was when Parliament decided that they seemed to think they have the authority to take the coronation oath, which in its original form was common law, essentially.
Yeah.
And take that text and write it into statute. And this is confusing a lot of people in the establishment at the moment, and even quite a lot of people in the sort of broader freedom movement as well, who are constitutional commentators, sort of giving credence, if you like, to the 1688 Coronation Oath Act. Yeah. No, it was absolutely, you could almost regard that as a treasonous act for Parliament itself to take the coronation oath, a piece of common law, and not only write it into statute, but also to alter the text as well. So up until 1688, the kings were all taking a coronation oath that was pretty much the same, and we've got records back to it's one of the Henrys, and I forget off the top of my head, it might have been Henry II, possibly, is the last record of the coronation oath text that we absolutely know. But we also have hints through historians, I think it's Eschard, possibly talking about William I as well, and how the laws were mingled with the coronation oath. I'll find the quotation in a minute. But essentially, that coronation oath is what places the monarch under the law. Right, that's the thing that clearly makes us a limited monarchy, which is that the king is under the law as well. And you're absolutely right for raising it, Damien. I should have even just chucked that into my little rant at the beginning, that the coronation oath is absolutely key, because that's the thing that keeps the monarch under wraps, under limitations, which is absolutely correct. So yeah. So it was a piece of common law text that they read out in their coronation oath, and everything was fine in that regard at this point. Up to this time, they were pretty much taking the same coronation oath, and that was the thing that was the promise that they were taking. And so if they were stepping out of line, it was absolutely right and proper that you could take a king aside and hold them to account under the promise that they were making at the coronation oath. And that's what happened, of course, at 1215. The reason why the barons in 1215 Magna Carta at Runnymede were able to take King John aside, and people say, oh, he was under duress and this was wrong. No, it wasn't wrong at all. It was absolutely correct that they did that, because he was already bound under the promises that he'd made under the oath, and he'd broken them. So it was absolutely not only their right as the barons and the archbishop and the bishops and all the assembled people at the time at Runnymede, it was a whole selection of people. It was absolutely correct that not only was it their right, but it was also their duty to take that king and hold him to account under a trial, which is the key thing that's missing in the understanding of people through the 17th century. They didn't really understand that that was the mechanism to hold a king to account, and they didn't use it properly.
And that is clearly why we've got this situation, because obviously Charles, he'd already breached his coronation early on.
Yeah.
And this kind of behaviour of not being accountable to any earthly authority is kind of a contradiction, isn't it?
Absolutely right. Yes, I've just found that quotation just quickly, actually. So
Yeah.
Matthew Hale, who's a historian, this is in 1 Hale's History of Common Law 157. Yet the English were very zealous for them. That's the laws of Edward the Confessor and the common law, no less or otherwise than they are at this time for the Great Charter, insomuch that they were never satisfied till the said laws were reinforced and mingled for the most part with the coronation oath of King William the First and some of his successors. There's an example of even right back to the Norman invasion. You've got William the First there, absolutely taking on the common law, understanding that he can be king of England now, but under limitation.
Yeah, because without that, they wouldn't be able to take that office, would they? That
No,
position.
that was the condition of the office. Absolutely right. Yeah.
It's astounding to me that nobody actually, even now, I don't think they bring it up. When we talk about the divine right of kings in this kind of era,
Yes.
nobody really talks about the coronation, the terms of that office.
Yeah. Oh, we were just laboring under the divine right of kings. Yeah. It doesn't even occur to them that that was completely illegitimate and should have
Do you
been
think,
dealt with.
do you think, Will, that it was just the king's mentality, or they were being badly advised as well with people around them?
Oh, absolutely. It's a whole mix. It's a whole of a thing of their own sort of ego resonating, but it's also the fact that the people around them didn't understand the concept. They didn't hold the Constitution here all the time, because you've got to be vigilant all the time. A people has to remind themselves all of the time. So, you could call it the remembering, if you like. And that's absolutely key to understand the sense of it and the essence of the constitutional rule of law. And they didn't keep that absolutely centered and keep themselves grounded in that way. And so the king's advisors were kind of gradually, incrementally over time, becoming less familiar with it. They were wavering. The king was taking more power for themselves. It was all incremental, gradually through generations that changes occurred and went very wrong. But if you don't keep that vigilance there, it starts to go wrong. And as you've said, Damien, quite clearly, that you've got to sort problems out early. Why? Because the stakes get really high. And that's when you start to realize that in order to set that straight again, that situation, people have to take more danger on. They have to be braver because the dangers are much higher in that situation. Whereas earlier on, when they're not such a problem, when they're just starting as seeds of problems, that's the time to deal with it and get in there fast. But quite often, I mean, this is one of the weaknesses of humanity, and we can go into the human psyche and all of that sort of thing at another time. And we're just touching on that. But the tendency to not call things out, it's really about the things that you're not calling out or not saying. Yeah, and we have a tendency as human beings to kind of let things just sort of slide under the carpet and try and forget about it. Things that are awkward, difficult to face, and that's the problem. Is that it's the things we're not doing often that causes the problems. And so that's when untruths set in and things become much bigger problems because of the things that we've not said.
Do you think the legislation and the rewrites of it kind of muddied the waters as well and confused how to actually approach constitutional law because it had been amended and messed with that many times?
Yeah, so I mean, we could absolutely we can go into this sort of very common misunderstanding. And again, this is a huge misunderstanding, not only in the establishment generally, and in the political class, but also again within the freedom movement largely. Other constitutional commentators also are not understanding this, that constitutional law cannot be held by statute. Okay, so if you're pointing to acts of parliament as if they are constitutional, you're not understanding the fact that statute or acts of parliament cannot contain the authority of the constitution. There's a difference. They can reflect constitutional principles in statute, but that's all they are, is just merely a reflection. Okay, what you will not find is the authority of the Constitution within statute. Now, there's a key reason for that, as you've just pointed out, the fact that statute can be amended and repealed so easily. The fact that any parliament can alter or repeal any statute, previous statute from a previous administration, means itself that statute cannot bind. It cannot be long-lasting. Yeah, so constitutional law, or powerful law, is law that constrains and binds future governments. That's the sign of constitutional law. Yeah, is law that can't be changed by a wayward government. So to claim that constitutional law can be contained within statute or acts of parliament is an own goal. You are defeating the very constitution that you're trying to uphold. Yeah, so this idea that and of course we've actually got the Petition of Right, haven't we, in 1628, which you've just had. Yeah. So we've got various sort of key moments where everybody says, oh no, we've got lots of English acts of parliament, of course, that are very key to the constitution. No, they're not. So wherever you've got, and again, I've just mentioned the 1688 Coronation Oath Act, can't possibly be constitutional because it's not about Parliament trying to write itself into constitutional authority. They're actually meant to be contained and limited within a box so that they don't get outside that box and misbehave. That's the whole point of a constitution. If you're then saying that the lawmaking mechanism of government itself has the ability to alter the framework in which they sit, then you're kind of saying, well, the Constitution's pointless. It doesn't actually do its key role, which is to limit the power of the government itself. And they get themselves in a right old mess. And everybody is in that mess because they're not understanding that basic principle.
That makes perfect sense, because how can you have the government in charge of the laws that are there to contain them, or potentially stopping them from becoming criminal in nature?
Absolutely right. So the Constitution is not supposed to be able to be changed by the government itself. That's the whole point. So, and that's what makes the difference between the 1215 Magna Carta, which was not legislation, by the way. So Parliament claiming that it can repeal the 1215 Magna Carta is absolutely absurd. There's no way that they could change it, because it wasn't even legislation. It wasn't even on the statute books for them to change. Yeah, it was what it was a promise that was binding the head of state. So that was in effect, it was a one-sided contract. Yeah, it didn't bind the people. What it bound was the government itself in perpetuity. Yeah, but the 1215, yeah, was basically not legislation. It was meant to be beyond the reach of Parliament. So absolutely key for people to understand that, definitely.
And you hear that so many times in the arguments, like people say when you talk about the Great Charter, the first thing that they say is it's been repealed. They kind of reference the 1297 version and, you know, start suggesting that there's only 4 clauses.
That's right.
Everything else has been repealed, but the underlying common law is still there.
Totally right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's the binding authority on the Constitution is coming from that. It's coming from the principles that are contained and expressed within the 1215 Magna Carta, but also from way before that too. And it's because it's natural law or natural justice. This is one of the reasons why people think of it as unwritten law, because in a way it is unwritten. It doesn't matter in a way whether the 1215 Magna Carta, they'd succeeded in writing that down, those principles down, or not. It doesn't really make any difference. It's still binding because natural law can't work any other way. Yeah, if you build yourself a community on those principles of natural justice, you'll thrive.
Yeah.
But if you build your community that works against those principles of natural justice, it will bring your community down. Ultimately, that is what natural law is all about. You're going to set in motion all kinds of negative dynamics that will absolutely take you out. It's self-sabotage. Yeah, and
I
this
think
is absolutely key that people understand this. So the principle of individual rights does not come from, wow, aren't we lucky that the Archbishop Stephen Langton and the barons were had enough foresight to write this down. No, it makes no difference whether they managed to. Your individual rights, your profound rights that you're born with, do not exist just because they happened to get it right and they had a good day and kind of sussed it out. It's not dependent on that. Whether they'd done it or not, it would still be truth.
those laws exist in nature and they're still binding regardless whether the Magna Carta was written or not. I think that's
Yes.
another stumbling block with people. They look to what's written down for
Yes.
answers.
Yeah.
You know, even if we talk about the Magna Carta, those principles were documented 200 years before the Great Charter. You know, them
Yeah.
principles, that way of like justice was going on in Europe. A,
Yes, it totally was.
a large
Absolutely correct.
proportion of Europe were under common law at the time, way before that. So even when people talk about you know, they hold on to the Magna Carta as if that's the be all and end all of what it's about, but it's more principle than written documents, I would say.
Totally correct. Yeah. This is it's logic and reason that it essentially cannot work any other way. And of course, as you say, Damien, you're right. What you're getting at, what you're driving at there is what I call the inevitability of it. And
Yeah,
this was picked up by the founding fathers of America as well in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these things to, I can't remember, I'm just paraphrasing because I can't remember exactly the text, but we hold these truths to be self-evident. Something like that along those lines, isn't it? That language.
yeah,
And that language is hinting at the idea that this is just truth. It's self-evident. Yeah, it's not because certain people have decided, yeah, that you can have individual rights. Yeah, what it's basically saying, this legitimate constitution of England, as opposed to an illegitimate constitution. The reason why it's legitimate is because it's basically saying, look, your individual rights are just a truth.
yeah.
Yeah, it's not for us to decide that you can have them or limit them at any point. And that's fundamentally different from most of the modern constitutions that are written today. Just to set the scene here as well, because I was talking about a delicate balance, because although it's quite true that the monarch, who is the head of state, the first among equals, has this these limitations placed upon him. And the way to deal with a wayward monarch, of course, is to put in place that similar event that we had at Runnymede, which is to bring them to trial. That is true. But it's also true to say that the head of state or the monarch under our constitution has an autonomy of their own, and they are supposed to have that autonomy. So the idea of a parliament is not to limit, it's the wrong way round, is not to limit the monarch in his governance. Yeah, so the idea that the king can create legislation at will, or actually even remove legislation at will, is absolutely correct, by the way. They are supposed to be able to do that. Why? Because they have the responsibility to make sure that there are fair and constitutional statutes on that statute book. It's ultimately their responsibility. So you can see that there's an important understanding here that Parliament, which has always been, explained to be a check on the monarch, that's not really true. They're meant to be advisors. What is the check is the threat of trial by jury and bringing the king to trial. Yeah, that's the key. So Parliament is an advisory thing, which came out of, well, it was really the Privy Council originally. And they were basically there to advise the king on good governance. And if a king was starting to kind of lose that sense of goodwill with his advisors, and things were starting to go wrong, then there of course is the constitutional mechanism in there to make sure that is put right and put straight. Yeah, but that's a different thing.
We kind of touched on that on the last video, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Like
Yeah.
towards the end, we didn't really
Yeah.
go into this much detail. But again, it's all to do with, as long as he uses his prerogative to do stuff in alignment with constitutional law,
Correct.
there isn't any issues.
Absolutely.
It's when Parliament or monarch, king, when they kind of delegitimize themselves once they breach that.
Absolutely. And then, of course,
Yeah,
they're not on the moral high ground and they can't call out the wrongdoing.
And that's when we're meant to step in.
Yes.
You know, with that, I suppose the mechanism that we're talking about that we touched on briefly is trial by jury.
Yeah.
That's the safety mechanism for that last check if things are going wayward. And that's what's predominantly missing from all these stories, I find, in history.
Totally right. Absolutely right. Yeah.
So this was a case during Charles's time regarding, because he was out of control and he'd dissolved Parliament, his means of taxing the people legitimately had gone. So he was kind of just doing it himself through forced loans and shipping tax and stuff like that. So he was just going to the people and taxing them directly. Sir Thomas Darnell, along with John Corbett, Sir Walter Earle, Sir Edmund Hampden, and Sir John Hevingham were arrested under the order of King Charles I for refusing to contribute to forced loans. So when they argued before the King's bench, they were actually bringing up the Magna Carta.
Yeah.
And saying that, you know, well, I'll read it. The knights wanted Charles to show cause for their imprisonment or release them on bail. In November 1627, their appeal for a writ of habeas corpus was argued before the King's bench.
Right. So this was another distraction, of course. And a lot of people think that these higher courts that are connected to the king themselves, which is, you know, the King's Bench, the Chancery Court, are somehow higher than common law. No. Okay, they're not. And another one was equity as well, of course, the Court of Equity, which is a confusing thing. And I think we touched on this, didn't we? And I think I did make the point in the last one that they formed these courts in a way as a kind of capturing exercise of our true common law courts. So the word equity, which basically means within our man-made law that we're all equal under the law, that's essentially what it is. So if you call your law, your special law, equity, then it sounds really impressive. But actually the common law court, which was the courts of conscience before trials, the petit trial by jury, as opposed to the grand trial by jury, was a court of conscience, and it was pure equity in a sense, because basically it was a perfect example of equity, because it was, you know, the people governing themselves. It was the people deciding on matters of, through their conscience, on matters of morality and justice within their own community. And so you can't get a law that is more equitable than a common law court based on the principle of trial by jury. So the formation of these higher king's courts was a distraction, and it was clearly a problem here. Absolutely.
So counsel for the knights appealed mostly to medieval precedents, including clause 39 of the Magna Carta, which stipulated that no man should lose his liberty without due process of law.
Yeah, and they were right to... you see, this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Is that you've got people in this system sort of half understanding it. They've got a sense that 1215 Magna Carta is the thing, is what they need to go back to. Those great principles of constitutional rule of law that were laid down back then. And so they're right. They have a sense of it, but they don't quite have that full understanding to carry it through often.
They spoke about, like what it says here, medieval precedents and that, and they talk about the Great Charter and Runnymede and everything else. But then they reference the legislation, the rewrite.
Yes.
So they're
Yes.
talking about Article 29 and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So because it's the same now, isn't it? I suppose
Totally.
because they believe that that holds weight in court because it's
Yes.
written legislation because it.
Yes, it's absolutely. And we'll come on to it later. It's like referencing the Bill of Rights, you know. Yeah, all right. If you're getting results in court, maybe, but don't leave it at that. You have to say also at the same time, don't leave in place the lie that a statute that was created by Parliament is the authority of the constitutional rule of law. It absolutely is not. Definitely not. And so that's the problem, is that what it's doing is it's sort of cementing in place this kind of erroneous idea that the Constitution sort of comes from government itself. It's absolutely absurd notion. It's a total contradiction. In fact, actually, there's another quite a good quotation here. I'll just read out. David Hume, another historian. The king, so far from being invested with arbitrary power, was only considered as the first among the citizens. His authority depended more upon his personal qualities than on his station. He was even so far on a level with the people that a stated price was fixed for his head, and a legal fine was levied upon his murderer, which, though proportionate to his station and superior to that paid for the life of a subject, was a sensible mark of his subordination to the community. So there's Appendix 1 of David Hume's History of England. I mean, it's just everywhere. All through our history of law, we've got this information, and history of England generally. It's all there. But that really demonstrates how the king is supposed to be. Yeah, it's a position of service.
So the Petition of Right was passed by both houses and eventually ratified by King Charles I on the 7th of June 1628. This document was drafted by a Commons Committee under the influence and guidance of Edward Coke. It set out to reaffirm the fundamental principles of the Magna Carta. Despite its good intentions, it does not legally and correctly qualify as constitutional. Like the Bill of Rights 1689, this is a statute and can be legitimately superseded by the legislature.
Perfectly put. Absolutely right. Yeah, because it can be altered and amended and changed means it cannot possibly be constitutional. But it's great. It may well reflect some excellent principles of the Constitution. Fantastic. There's no problem with doing it. Of course, the other danger that we need to remember, of course, is that the government is perfectly capable of reflecting good constitutional principles in its legislation, but it can also slip in some erroneous ideas into that as well that conflict with or contradict those constitutional principles. So although it's good, it's well intentioned, it's potentially quite dangerous as well.
Yeah, it can be used as a tool as well.
Yes.
This is the problem, isn't it? Like what we've been saying with statutes.
This particular issue, this erroneous idea that legislation of the government itself can contain constitutional authority. Absolutely no way.
I think it's a good time to talk about constitutional statutes.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes. Constitutional statutes. Yes, because that's a contradiction. So, and I describe it in one of my recent articles, which is in the resources section of commonlawconstitution.org, and it's called the cyclic argument of parliamentary sovereignty. And the reason why I'm calling it a cyclic argument is because you can end up just going round and round in circles. There's no authority for this. And I deal with this issue about parliamentary sovereignty in that, and I talk about the fact that statute law or legislation cannot contain constitutional authority. It just can't do that. We've just dealt with that issue. But yes, you're right. There is a sort of a modern invention of what they call constitutional statutes, which is just wishful thinking, really, on the part of the establishment. Now, one of the things, some of those constitutional statutes, they call them constitutional for the reasons that we've just given, which is that they contain ideas, notions, or principles that are constitutional. And it has been suggested by some that the government, Parliament, can't, the legislature, if you want to be more accurate, can't then repeal the bits of their legislation that contain constitutional principles, because by doing that they would be, basically acting criminally, essentially, because it's kind of like saying this is no longer the Constitution. So in other words, they're perfectly it's perfectly within their rights to express constitutional principles in their legislation, but then they can come unstuck if they want. They can't repeal it because those truths are stuck in there. They can't then repeal them, right? So some people have suggested that they sort of are constitutional only in the sense that they've written them, but they can't now repeal them because they are truths. Possibly. Now, there's another section, another sort of area of constitutional statutes, which is to do with the mechanism of implied repeal. So normally the idea with a statute, if you have statute A, let's say, that's written in 1800, statute B that's written in 1900, if statute B sort of conflicts or overlaps with statute A, then normally what they do is they're quite good at sort of putting in the legislation quite clearly in statute A, oh, this part has been repealed because of statute B that came later. And usually they're quite good, actually, at writing that information in there quite clearly and explicitly. But what implied repeal mechanism is that if they forget to do that, or they're not specific about it, then basically the general principle is that the later statute repeals the earlier one to the extent that it overlaps. Now, what they've done is they've created a mechanism where they've removed that implied repeal. So they can say, for example, that, right, we're going to create a new statute in 2024, which is just really important because we think this is really important. All it means is that it becomes a bit more sticky in that any future statute that they create in, say, 2026 or whenever, we don't know, doesn't automatically repeal impliedly that. It just can't do it automatically. All that means is that they can still repeal the 2024 statute, but they have to do it explicitly. They just have to go through an extra hoop, an extra stage to kind of make sure that happens. That's all it is. Yeah, and they've called those kind of statutes where they've removed that implied repeal thing, they've called them constitutional statutes because they think they've got a mechanism for sticking those in place a little bit more solidly. But that's not what it means. It doesn't mean that it's constitutional in nature. It's just a misapplying terms that just tricks and miseducates the establishment, politicians, everybody in the political class. They don't understand what the subtlety of what this is about. And of course, people in the freedom movement as well are not really understanding it either. You just need to go a little bit deeply into that. But yeah, partly that's to do with implied repeal as well. That's quite a lot of detail. We're getting into some quite serious stuff there. But yeah, that's what constitutional statutes means. They're not constitutional at all, or they may just reflect constitutional principles, but it doesn't mean they are constitutional law.
Even the notion of implied repeal isn't solid in a sense, because these kind of statutes have already been tampered with.
Yes, quite exactly.
Have been amended and repealed.
Right. So we'll come on to this later, of course, but it's so tempting, isn't it? But the Bill of Rights that everybody likes to use and point to, the 1689 Bill of Rights. Oh no, that's a really constitutional statute. It's absolutely fundamental. Okay, so where's Section 3 then? Which has been removed and repealed. Yeah, exactly. And they're very coy. And isn't it funny, and we'll come on to this later, that Section 3 was the one where they referenced Magna Carta as well in it. But, we'll remove that. So they can not only remove important statutes or sections of statutes, proving that it's not constitutional law, but also they think they seem to be able to remove sections that actually reference important documents like Magna Carta.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah. Anyway.
It's even for me, the biggest stumbling block is the whole idea of issuing rights to somebody
Yes.
through statutory law.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just doesn't make
Statute
sense
is
even
meant to
on that
be.
level, does it? It's kind of saying that they have the ability to do that, to issue rights or to take them away, and that's just not true.
Absolutely right. I mean, it's the whole point of statute is that it's not meant to be able to punish by itself. So all it's really there for is a red flag exercise in order to bring a defendant before a court of his peers, a court of conscience. That's all it is, which means the statute's not providing the punishment. Okay, it's the decision of the jury that gives the punishment if they feel it would be right to do so. Another interesting quotation here from Sir Geoffrey Gilbert. No cause of consequence was determined without the king's writ, for even in the county courts of the debts which were above 40 shillings, there issued a justices, a commission to the sheriff, to enable him to hold such a plea where the suitors, that's the jurors, are the judges of law and fact. Yeah, so in other words, no statute can provide punishment without the decision of the jury. Yeah, so statute is low. It's subordinate to the common law and to the decision of the juries. That's the key. And of course, that also means that there wasn't in back in the day when government was a kind of in its more raw, purer form, if you like. There wasn't much statute. They couldn't have very much statute because it was quite difficult to have statute on the books that wasn't in some way breaching with the decisions of jurors. So you any statute that you created had to be in alignment with the common law. It had to be in alignment with what was going to be the decisions of jurors, essentially. And that's not easy to achieve that as well.
Isn't that what's going on today, though, Will, in
Yeah.
like summary trials and stuff? We say legislation hasn't got the power to punish, but isn't that what's going on?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah. So
You know,
that's the problem. This is where the absolutely the constitution is being distorted. So we now have well, we have for a very long time, but they haven't understood how this is supposed to operate. But the magistrates' courts are basically summary trials mostly. I mean, it's they would claim, of course, that our magistrates are our peers because they are essentially voluntary. But the trouble is that they swap out state-paid judges in a magistrates' court. There are only 3 of them. They're not selected at random. It's not 12. It's all sorts of issues there. And we won't get into that because there's loads of detail that we could get into about the magistrates' court, actually, which is not usually worse, but actually sometimes it's better than our current trial by jury that we have today. Is in some ways is better because the magistrate gets to decide the punishment and all kinds of things. But there's all sorts of interesting detail that we won't get into now about that because it goes. We'd be here all day, but it's quite interesting. Yeah, definitely. But you're right, that's a problem. So summary trial is an issue because that's fundamentally going against the principle of the Constitution. Yeah.
after the clashes with Parliament over the Petition of Right and news of the Duke of Buckingham's murder, Charles chose to dispense with Parliament and take on the role of an absolute monarchy. Charles wouldn't recall Parliament for 11 years in what is known as the personal rule. The king surrounded himself with a small council of loyal subjects and would govern with the help of these civil and religious officials. So there was 2 noteworthy people, which was William Laud, who he made Archbishop of Canterbury
Yeah.
in the end, and Thomas Wentworth, who dealt with, he actually was, I think he was based in Ireland. So he was kind of pushing the king's affairs in Ireland. And I suppose that's a continuation of what happened with the plantations of Ulster
Yes.
and the plantations of Ireland.
The Irish people were just treated abominably around this time. We could comment at that point about the sort of, how do you think you're going to get away with this? So there's no sense here that if you act irresponsibly and immorally consistently towards people, and you're not honest with yourself and conducting yourself with integrity, how do you think that's going to turn out? How do you think that things are not going to come back at you? So what
Exactly.
we're hinting at here is negative karmic consequence. Yeah, because it is in play. That is the basis of natural law. And probably the biggest issue is the fact that people don't recognize or understand how negative karmic consequence is a real thing. These are real, recognizable dynamics that affect us from our attitudes to our behaviors to our actions. And when we put things in place, we're going to get effects back. And here is a case in point. You are consistently behaving irresponsibly, just unconscionable behavior. And if that's the way that you're going to behave, you're going to get stuff back. And that's exactly what was happening to Charles. He was going more and more wildly off track by not taking responsibility, not taking his position seriously, irritating people around him all the time. You're not getting the support, so you're going to lose the support. That's another dynamic that's going to get into place. If people can't trust you, who are around you and are serving with you, then you're not going to get their support, which means that when things really turn out nasty, they're not going to support you. Quite the opposite. And how you don't see this is quite remarkable. These kings were not only wildly off track and dangerous, they were just dangerous to themselves as well. Anyway, rant over. There you
I
go.
just don't think they got it, did they? Although we've got the free will choice to align with natural law or not.
Oh, yes.
These kind
Yeah.
of people just didn't. They just weren't moral in any
Yeah.
sense of the word.
Yeah.
So with these laws that are already in effect, it's only a matter of time. It doesn't have to be instant karma.
No, rarely, and it rarely is, because it's to do with the unfolding of a complex set of dynamics. You can think of the universe as a sort of a complex system. That's a little bit patronizing to the universe, but it helps sometimes to think of it like that. But essentially, you're kind of, it takes a while for effects to unravel, and but essentially, at a fairly objective scientific level, that's what we're seeing. We're basically see negative karmic consequence coming back to us through. Usually, it's not the things that you quite noticeably do, although in this case, it quite obviously is. Normally, for most people, it's what you're not doing. It's the things that you like to brush under the carpet and not call out. When you're not jumping to the defense of truth, usually it's that, because it's much more subtle and it's much easier to suppress in the subconscious that that's what's going on. But with this guy, it was really obvious stuff. You're actually going out and really harming people and doing stupid stuff, and you're not thinking how that's not going to come and bite you. Amazing.
Even as advisors, they're not calling out that behavior.
Morally reprehensible, all of this stuff. These are not good leaders, are they?
No.
Not that we're looking always to have leaders as such, because we should be, sovereign, we should be self-governing, etc. But there's nothing wrong with a leader who demonstrates something great. This is the opposite. We're not seeing greatness in these leaders. Quite the opposite.
Well, you're just looking for moral principle, aren't you, really?
Yes,
You're just looking for
totally.
somebody to have some sort of integrity,
Yeah,
and stand for truth instead of trying to bend it out of shape, which is what
completely.
Charles was doing.
Yeah,
Just going against the truth,
yeah,
even towards the end, and we will see that later. He's still adamant. He's still going against the truth, that he's completely out of touch, even at the end. So this is where it all really kicked off, Will. And I don't really like getting into religion, but I suppose we've got to address it in some shape or form, even if
yeah,
it's just brief. So what happened then? Because Charles Well, I suppose it was William Laud as well. Wanted to kind of uniform religion across the board. You know, Scotland, they were Presbyterian, so they had their own churches, kirks, and
Yes.
they kind of elected their own ministers to deal with the affairs of the church. So they didn't really have any sort of interference. But what Lord, whether it was Charles and Lord was kind of imposing that will, was to try and unify everything. So impose their own bishops, impose the Church of England on Scotland, basically,
Absolutely.
like a
Yeah.
high Anglican
Imposing.
way of worship, which was completely against Presbyterian.
Oh dear. I mean, this is such a distraction from the key issues. And in a way, actually, you could say that we could point back to the framers of the 1215 Magna Carta. One of the most important, of course, was the Archbishop Stephen Langton, who actually at the time demonstrated his understanding that there is something greater than, I don't know, the recognition of God's representative on earth of the Pope. Because soon after, he actually um, there was a division between Stephen Langton and the Pope, and so if that's not a division in matters ecclesiastical, I don't know what is,
Yeah,
But the point is that Stephen Langton recognised something much more important in the constitutional document that he was writing, which is that about natural justice. The fact that God's law is really about individual rights and natural justice. And it's the principle of non-interference, the principle of stop interfering in other people. You don't have the moral right to do so. And so he was recognizing this, understood this, and probably had to talk to the barons somewhat in making that clarity and schooling them in that to some extent. But even by this point in English history, we've still got these massive distractions to do with the style of the church, the style of the liturgy, the style of these are not important constitutional principles. They thought they were at the time, but it's messy. And I agree with, like you, Damien. I don't like to get into this stuff, but it's a big problem. Yeah,
I couldn't believe how many factions and styles of religion there actually was at this time.
yeah,
You know, you obviously had Presbyterian, Anglican, Episcopalian. You know, you had like, heavily influenced Calvinism,
yes.
Arminianism. So much confusion.
Oh, completely. And one of the interesting things actually about this period in history, as we got towards the Enlightenment, and the age of humanism, if you like, is that the church sort of invalidated its own authority because it was bringing about a sort of a more egalitarian thinking. So it was kind of bringing about its own destruction because it was leading society more towards an individualism, a place where people started to realize that actually it's not about the style of the church. It's not about the church imposing its authority on others. And so, in a sense, they were bringing about their own destruction by raising humanity's consciousness, if you like, so that by the time we got to the time this century that we're looking at now, and particularly the 18th century, the 1700s, where humanity was more about things like starting to throw up these questions about individual rights. Unfortunately, what happened though was that they spawned this erroneous understanding of voting as
Yeah.
and political majority voting, which in a way was their thinking that was more individualist, which it actually wasn't. It's quite the opposite. It's more collectivist. But you can see that society was being driven away from sort of authoritarianism of the church, certainly, which was shocking when you think about what was going on under the church back in the 1100s, 1200s with the the Inquisition and things like that, and And we just recently had in the early 1600s with the with James the First about witchcraft as well, and
Yeah.
burning and hanging women and all the rest of it. I mean, just awful stuff, you know. But actually, we're beginning to come out of that, and so yeah, the sort of awfulness of the church, of the way that it was behaving, almost kind of caused the spring of humanity to kind of come back out of that in a sense. But yeah, that's another whole area we could get into. But yeah, interesting stuff.
What I was thinking was religion being used in a way as if that's what it was about, but it was really political.
Yeah.
It wasn't
Uh,
really about the religion. Obviously, I don't know whether it was Jordan this time. I think it was more so after. I think it was Jordan Charles II when I was reading on that, and you'd had the spread of anti-Catholic rhetoric,
yes.
plus hysteria about Catholics taking over. You know, you had the popish plots and all that kind of stuff. But I think it was more so like political,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Totally. Yeah.
with James II, being a Catholic, it was kind of to, I think to start with, it was to try and stop him from taking the throne.
Yes. Yes.
So,
Oh, totally. Yeah. There were all kinds of agendas at play here, and yeah, absolutely.
they were even trying to push like legislation and that to exclude him. It was this Book of Common Prayer that aimed to bring the Scottish Church, which was Presbyterian, in line with the Church of England, which was kind of like High Anglican. When it was first introduced, it caused riots in Scotland. The liturgy, order of service, was seen as popish, as the Church of England and Anglicanism was established, combining elements of both Protestantism and Catholicism. It was known as Lord's Liturgy, as he helped compose it along with Scottish bishops, not to be confused with ministers or elected elders within the Scottish Church that played no part in its creation. Presbyterians followed the form of Protestantism, which was influenced by John Calvinism, and introduced to Scotland by John Knox's liturgy. Trying to impose this book of prayer and impose bishops on the kirks was, I mean, Scotland just weren't going to have it. They were
Yeah.
completely outraged at this point. There was riot after riot when this was when they tried to impose this.
Yeah. Again, it's about coercion, isn't it?
I suppose it's collectivism as well, isn't it? The outcome of the Common Book of Prayer and the idea of imposing bishops on the church, on the Scottish Church, they drew up the National Covenant in 1638, which was an agreement signed by many people of Scotland opposing the actions of the state attempting to implement religious changes on the Scottish Church. The
Yeah.
changes would allow the establishment of England to appoint their own bishops dealing with the affairs of the kirks. The changes would also include a common book of prayer that didn't align with the Presbyterian religion. The National Covenant was seen as an act of rebellion against the king. This is what ultimately led to what is known as the Bishops' Wars. This is how the faction of Scotland who rejected these changes came to be known, the Covenanters. So yeah, they drew this up because, quite frankly, they were ready to just take up arms. That's
Yeah.
how serious this was. They weren't going to allow the state to impose these changes on their religion.
Completely. Yeah.
The Bishops' Wars. Charles tried to develop a more English-style religious practice in Scotland, introducing the Common Book of Prayer, which infuriated Scottish Protestant factions that had broken away from Roman Catholicism. This led to the Bishops' Wars of 1639 and 1640. Charles was first defeated in 1639 in the First Bishops' War and forced to make peace. Unwilling to accept defeat, Charles recalled Parliament to help finance another war. It only lasted 3 weeks with no agreement in place, which is known as the Short Parliament. Without funds to raise a sufficient army, Charles was defeated for the second time in what was known as the Second Bishops' War, and Scotland took control of northern England. A demoralised Charles recalled Parliament for the second time to try and settle the conflict, which is known as the Long Parliament. During the political instability in London that the Bishops' Wars had caused, Irish Catholics started an uprising in 1641, what was known as the Irish Rebellion. There are several political, economic, and religious reasons. Plantations of Ireland, I should say English Protestant settlers, because the union hadn't happened then. Loss of land, debt and poverty, loss of political power, and anxiety and fear of invasion from English parliamentarians and Scottish Covenanters that may have caused further suppressive economic, political, and religious measures. So they were kind of between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
And maybe they seen it as an opportunity to try and gain some of them liberties back, some sort of power back for themselves, maybe. The Earl of Strafford was one of the king's leading advisors, who was also the Lord Deputy of Ireland, handling Charles' affairs there. Although responsible for some positive changes, he was mainly guilty of using authoritarian techniques and heavy-handed measures to push the king's agenda. Not popular in Ireland or Parliament. Recalled to England by Charles during the Long Parliament, he was impeached and charged with high treason. Parliament failed in their bidding, but passed a bill of attainder. Annulment of civil rights and due process of law. No trial by jury. The king, I think he was basically forced to sign his death warrant.
Yeah, it's just getting really bad at this point now. So, I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? Is that when you've got a king who's not actually doing what he should be doing, not taking responsibility, not doing the stuff. So you've got others wanting to step in. You've got the frustration mounting over years because they're not able to provide any kind of input into this. It's kind of not surprising. It's weird. It's just like, the monarch made itself so unpopular that it was like driving the country's situation towards absolute catastrophe. I mean, it's just was bound to kind of brew up the most appalling stuff. And he couldn't see it. It just, the level of arrogance was just staggering. So it's really, in a way, not surprising that, yeah, what was supposed to be the king's advisors were getting desperate by this point. Just awful,
The way they went about the process to get justice was just completely immoral. I
Yeah,
mean, bills of attainder to
yeah,
execute people. We're talking about annulment of civil rights, and not just
completely.
annulment of civil rights. If they had any sort of inheritance or their families were affected as well.
So you're right, actually. So the point needs to be made. You're absolutely right at this point that you're starting to if you start to show hypocrisy in your argument as one party against another party, then you've sacrificed your ability to take the moral high ground. So at that point, you've lost integrity, and you're just simply one faction fighting another, and you're just having a war. You've kind of reduced it down to that. So if you thought you had the moral high ground previously over an out of control criminal king, now you're in a place where, well, you don't really have that moral high ground anymore, do you? You're just behaving just as badly as the other guy. So I think
Exactly.
that point probably needs to make. I can express that if you want. Yeah, definitely.
It's back to that foundational topic of conversation of morality.
Yes, you can't bring somebody to trial when you yourself have just demonstrated hypocrisy as well. All you're in is a war between two factions at that point. You can't take the moral high ground. You can't judge a situation and bring somebody to account. You've lost that position. Yeah, it's an important one because this is why the freedom movement largely can't do that at the moment. They're not interested in bringing the government to account properly under constitutional law. Why? Because actually we're all invested in immorality in a sense but through hypocrisy. You know, we know subconsciously all the time that we're giving away our power because we want government to do stuff for us. We're outsourcing. So we're corner cutting our lives. We're not taking responsibility. We want government to help us out and do stuff, and yet at the same time, we're sort of hurling abuse at them and all the rest of it. It's the same problem. You can only judge somebody when you yourself are whiter than white, and these guys were not.
In these kinds of cases, why did they believe that the only way of gaining justice was to annul someone's civil liberties? Where were the courts of common law? Suppression of authentic trial by jury?
Yeah, it feels like the efforts are a bit desperate and a bit wayward. Because it's a little bit about like optics. You can't sort of go about like barefaced kind of like operating way outside the law, quite obviously so, because then the optics are pretty bad. From a PR point of view, it doesn't look great, does it?
No.
So actually, when you're behaving like this, what the hell's causing it? Is it just that they're so desperate because they feel that I mean, maybe it is that's driving it. Maybe they are in a situation where they feel that the country is in a really bad state, that they're about to get to a kind of catastrophic position. They probably were. Maybe this is what is indicating how bad things have actually got, that they feel that it's dangerous. There's whispering around every corner. You can't trust anyone. You don't know what side they're on. Do you know what I mean?
Desperation to get things done quickly, even if that was a model, that this is for the greater good.
Yeah, this is ultimately losing control. And you've got to get this thing done, whatever. And so the stakes are high, as I often say. That's when things are getting to that point where the stakes are that high. You have to solve this problem one way or another. And if it's got that bad, you're not really worried about optics anymore. You're not even worried about your own morality.
This is the real revolution.
I mean, this is just absolute intransigence here. This is just pure belligerence, intransigence. It's just unbelievable what's going on here. It's a total meltdown.
William Laud fell a bit later, probably during the first Civil War. He was in prison to start with.
Yeah.
But again, it was a bill of attainder.
That
sealed his fate. Well, William Laud was a political and religious advisor and shared the king's views on such topics. He was opposed to the Presbyterian religion and Calvinist ideology. Instead, he favoured the High Anglican approach based on Arminianism, with some similarities to Catholicism. When he was made Archbishop of Canterbury, Laud started to make religious reforms. Laud was suspected of being a crypto-Catholic and was referred to by many as the Pope of Canterbury. The events leading to the Bishops' Wars would eventually spill out into full civil war. This marked the end of Laud as parliamentarians would start to dismantle the king's advisors. He was charged with treason, but it didn't stick, so a bill of attainder was used to find guilt and execute Laud. The Grand Remonstrance, which was a list of grievances put together by John Pym, who was a member of Parliament, and proposed to King Charles I, outlining Parliament's issues regarding the king's foreign, financial, legal, and religious policies. It sought to address several things, including the illegal levying of ship money, the arbitrary use of courts to obtain the preferred results, Star Chamber. It used monarch-appointed judges without the right to trial by jury to prosecute people and imprison people. Calling Parliament and dissolving at will was another thing. So at any time he just felt like he couldn't deal with Parliament, he'd just dissolve it.
Yeah.
And obviously, without redress of his subjects' grievances, it challenged the king's powers to appoint his own officials. The document proposed Parliament could veto over crown appointments.
Lack of morality on both sides. They should have dealt with it properly earlier. They should have known how to deal with it. And now it's just like two factions just hurling abuse at each other. Um, just
Like
awful.
the rule of law has gone out the window at this point, hasn't it? This just broke relations completely.
Yes.
What Charles did, he basically attempted to have the members of Parliament responsible for that document arrested, and
Yeah.
Parliament basically said no, a proper standoff. It didn't matter that Charles was the king. That's when Charles left London, which I think was probably a mistake.
Yes, I mean all bets are off at this point, aren't they, really?
You've got Scotland they've defeated Charles twice in the Bishops' Wars. He's lost face with trying to impose religion on Scotland. He's recalled Parliament for support, and they've kicked off. Shortly after, the Irish have kicked off. How would you deal with that? As you said, I think it's the point of no return. There's
Yeah,
going to be
totally.
some sort of war.
I think you're right. I think this is probably worse, far worse than what happened later. I mean, it's the worst point in English history.
The king's failure to impose his authority on Parliament, along with the failed attempts to arrest its members responsible for the Grand Remonstrance, was the final straw for Charles. Parliament saw the king's actions as an abuse of power, and trust between the two completely broke down. The king left London to build an army, and he eventually raised his royal standard at Nottingham in August of 1642, marking his open declaration of war against Parliament. Battles between royalist and parliamentarian forces ensued. Even though the royalists experienced some early success, it was the parliamentarian victories at Marston Moor and Naseby that proved decisive and led to Charles's downfall. He surrendered to Scottish Covenanters in 1646, who eventually handed him over to Parliament.
Yes, for some money, I think.
Yeah, it was. There's quite a few things there. They latched onto that in his case
Yeah,
towards the end. They used that raising of the royal standard as a declaration of war, waging war
yeah.
on his own people. That's what they focused on.
It's just the most shocking waste of money as well. I mean, look, let's spend our resources on good governance at home and making sure that the people are happy and that the country is just it's running smoothly. And instead we'll just spend it on arguments and wars and battles, and it's just not
There's a
understanding what you're really all about. What you're supposed to be about is just to make sure that the country is functioning and is happy, and the people are you're upholding the people's individual rights, and you're bringing about justice, and it's an absolute inversion of what you should be doing.
It split the country, and I'm not just talking about like places. I'm talking about families. I'm
Yeah,
talking about father and son in different
yeah,
factions of the armies, the royalist and
yes,
parliamentarian actually
yeah.
fighting each other. It's absolutely horrific to think that is what went on. The parliamentarians signed the Solemn League and Covenant in 1643, forming an alliance with the Presbyterian Covenanters, ending any religious reforms being imposed on their kirks. There was also a restructure of the parliamentarian army, creating the new model army led by Thomas Fairfax, Oliver Cromwell, and Henry Ireton. If the charter, the principles of common law and trial by jury was imposed on Charles long before this,
Yeah.
then there wouldn't have been an issue. Do you think so many people around at this time who weren't calling anything out or weren't standing for truth is why we got this. Was this the karmic consequence?
Things get worse on their own, right? So if you don't expose wrongdoing, or you don't expose untruths early, then those lies, which is just fictions, will just develop into absolute monsters. And that's the problem on whatever side you are, really. So yeah, it wasn't dealt with early enough. That's the problem, and we've kind of got that problem now as well, because the stakes are so high in a way. People think, I think that we're gonna solve the problem that we're in right now of our sort of lack of liberty and all the rest of it by just exposing a kind of a corruption behind the scenes. That's not going to do it, because what that will do is bring things down completely. What you have to do is grow up.
Yeah.
Really. It's not all about retribution and punishment, about hurling abuse at the other side. It's about realizing that we all had a part to play in letting this situation deteriorate. And we can learn a lot from this. Yeah.
Don't you think, Will, as well, like the world we live in today with like social media and everything else that's going on, where we focus on the symptoms, but there's never a resolution amongst it. We kind of, like what you said before, we're in we're at a point where we're just trying to expose more and more stuff, but we're not actually putting anything in place to deal with what's been exposed. Or
Absolutely right. Yeah, just continuing to expose problems. And we know that there's corruption, and corruption happens naturally. It's it's a consistent just letting things slide and not calling things out. Yeah, and we all do that. We do it in our own lives. And if you think about it, you've got people coming in and out of office within government all the time, and so people newly come into office, and they inherit a situation they didn't know existed before, but they've now discovered that 10 years before, 20 years before, 50 years before, something wasn't addressed. And now we've got a problem that we've just discovered having come into this office. Is it me that now has to carry that can? No.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's better that I just shut up about it and not say anything, right? So this is the kind of nature. I mean, it's a big subject to get into, the sort of psychology of man, as to how we prefer not to face difficult truths. But that it's a whole topic in itself. And you can get into concepts like Wetiko and all kinds of things, but ultimately, and that deserves a kind of discussion of its own, and maybe we should at some point get into
definitely. It's the thought of, I always think, why do people focus on problems more than solutions as well?
It's not so much how they focus on problems. They like the sort of the salaciousness of it, and the fact that it's it's a bit sort of gossipy, and oh my God, have you heard what's happened? And look at this piece of conspiracy, and look at this piece of corruption, and all the rest of it. And actually, the problem is that they're not really understanding problems at the causal factor, as you just hinted at.
Yeah.
If you understand problems at the causal factor, right at the base, you'll understand actually that it's usually incremental over a very long period of time. The seeds of that destruction are no worse than the things that we all do in all our lives. And yeah, the nature of corruption at the biggest level is that it's become a monster, usually as a result of neglect, people not doing things rather than what they have done. And even where it is actually full-blown conspiracy, and it's people actually absolutely knowledgeably doing things that they know they shouldn't be doing. Well, what's happened is that you've allowed people to get into those positions who are absolutely irresponsible and completely inappropriate for those positions. But we've, in a sense, through neglect, allowed them to rise to those positions. So these are the kind of negative consequences that that we all put into place that bring about those effects just through that neglect, through not looking at things and having the guts to call it out, having courage, having enough care, the care principle that I talk about a lot, which is represented by the G in Freemasonry. What do you care enough about in the world to put your will behind? I talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
Well, that includes the things that you're not looking at and not prepared to see, the things you're sweeping under the carpet that you don't want to talk about. So yeah, absolutely.
The Engagers were a faction of the Scottish army split from the Covenanters. They contacted Charles in December of 1647 during his imprisonment in Carisbrooke Castle after his defeat in the First Civil War to negotiate terms of an alliance. Charles agreed to impose Presbyterianism in England for 3 years in exchange for their support. It's known as the Engagement. Around 9,000 marched into England to support royalist uprisings. All were quashed by parliamentarian forces. It was that famous battle at Preston. Cromwell defeated the Engagers. On the 6th of December 1648, in what has become to be known as Pride's Purge, Thomas Pride, on what is believed to be Henry Ireton's orders and not the orders of Sir Thomas Fairfax, purged Parliament of its moderate members. They were supporters of a negotiation and settlement with the king. To explain in simpler terms, a small army stood at the doors of Parliament refusing a list of members' entry. What was usually up to 500 members was whittled down to around 40 to 80 members. This was known as the Rump Parliament and now consisted mostly of members that wanted to remove Charles and put the king on trial. This faction was known as the Independents and wanted radical change. Oliver Cromwell and his brother-in-law were independents and radicalised the New Model Army. Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was the commander-in-chief of the New Model Army and a moderate, eventually lost control and had no choice but to follow the lead of Cromwell and Ireton. This is where I'm suggesting, I don't fully know, but that Fairfax might have been a little bit spineless, that he didn't deal with it, that he didn't face it. He kind of, once it had got out of hand, he kind of just fell into the background and walked away.
Yeah, and probably exhausted by this point because he was basically quite a good man. I think he had a sense of where things should be going. He understood a little more how that things should operate. But by this point, I suspect he felt he was running out of options. He was exhausted by the whole business. He didn't have enough support around him.
How do we evolve?
It's about the people being vigilant all the time, understanding natural justice, understanding natural law, and understanding the propensity for human psychology to self-sabotage and to take yourself down. If you understand all of those things, you'll have the most wonderful society. And what you will then perceive is an evolution in human consciousness. But you see, that's the thing, is that all of this is an exercise in that, really. This is ultimately really about just us going through lessons to understand where we've gone wrong before. Can we learn from those lessons so that it projects us into a higher state of consciousness so that we can learn from this kind of stuff? Or are we going to do the opposite, where we just keep repeating the same things over and over again? Humanity really needs to give itself a kick up the backside. This is not actually just about conspiracy, I'm afraid. It's about the dynamics that we put in place, ultimately. It's really down to us. And if we were to do it, actually, my God, you would see a fast change if it happened. If people absolutely decided, they get the bit between their teeth and decide, no, actually, I'm going to do this. If it suddenly became quite a thing, let's do this. Let's actually bring about greater integrity in our lives. Let's become authentic so that we're actually real. We're not putting on personas and we're not just lying to ourselves about things. If you actually decided in large numbers to do that, it wouldn't take long. it's not easy. And we battle with this all the time. All through our lives, it's about self-improvement. It's about the hero's journey. It's what is called the hero's journey. But we can all do it. We can all decide to go through that and make those differences. And my goodness, would it make a difference to our society? Because I'm suggesting that corruption, chaos, catastrophe, all of that, and conspiracy, of course, as well, will actually just wither away by itself. You don't have to solve it by figuring out what the conspiracy is. It will unravel by itself the more that people are moving into integrity.
If we're all focused, well, larger numbers than what we are now, focused on morality, then it will wither away, won't it?
If you are honest with yourself, yes. If large enough numbers in society are honest with themselves and are interested in these subjects, then it can only improve. Yes. But that's the question, right? If people turn away from those subjects and they don't want to look at that, they don't want to look at the darkness, it's not a given, no. It's not inevitable. And that terrifies people.
Yeah.
But you can do something about it, yes. But only if you do something about it.
Yeah. This is why we should be learning from history, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
We should be learning from what's gone before.
Yeah.
They're valuable lessons, aren't they?
Yeah. It's not actually that long ago. That's the thing in the big scheme of things of human evolution.
No, it isn't.
And we're only talking 300 years ago. So, and actually, let's be honest. When was the last time that we had absolute catastrophe in Europe? 39 was it? 49. Sorry, 39. Not 39 to 45. I'm getting my dates right. I mean, look what happened in Germany. It can all go that way. That was only that long ago. And if you follow orders, if you think that following orders is okay, look at what happened there. Do you think that you're going to be the person that sticks their neck out in an environment like Nazi Germany? Well, don't let it get that far, is the answer. Spot the signs when you think your society is starting to descend into tyranny and damn well speak out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, and we're heading that way fast again.
That's a good message, Will. It is. Some of it is a bit depressing, but we need to talk about it.
Just got to be honest,
Yeah, of course.
And it's kind of depressing or positive, but if we actually did something about it, we could solve this quite quickly, I reckon.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think we can.